Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is all about serious thinking for a serious church. I'm Jordan Stefaniak, host of Kiffin's Keep and president of the London Lyceum, and as always, I'm excited to be here with you all today. In today's episode, I'm going to be covering the topic of Nicene Theology, what it is, what it isn't, who counts as Nicene and who doesn't, and of course, why talk about this? Well, in part because I saw something really stupid on the internet, but also because it's the 1700th anniversary of the Nicene Creed, so the more Nicene Theology talk we can get, the better, especially on the YouTube sphere where there's all amounts of crazies. Before we jump into the episode, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment if you've got thoughts or ideas. I know 75% of you watching this have not subscribed to the channel, so do make sure to subscribe. I've tried recording this video several times now over the last couple of days, and each time I start, within 2 minutes, my youngest son wakes up crying because our family is sick. So let's see how this goes. Fourth time's the charm. We'll see. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen because that's fun. What prompted this was something so ridiculous, I'm not sure if it deserves airtime, and yet here we are anyway. Unitarian Christian Alliance, talking about stuff, weird stuff as always. And then Dale Tuggy, who is a nice guy but very wrong, says, this is how the famous Arian controversy ended. Not by consensus, but by the emperor deciding the winner, then enforcing Nicene orthodoxy. The next year, the bishops obediently met in his capital city, and that is where we get the first Trinitarian Creed from. This is so wrong, it hurts. So let's also go to something that I have written in the past to give a little bit of a sense for the silliness of this. So what people don't know or aren't aware of, I gotta share that screen. Okay, here we go. All right, so you guys see this. So I wrote a fairly decent-sized essay once on a couple of important Trinitarian terms, but I want to highlight this. What's fascinating is in our story of the development of the Trinitarian doctrine is that from 328 to 373, the deck's actually stacked against the Nicene Creed. So it's not stacked in favor of it. There's not any reason to think that Nicene theology is going to win out. It's actually only kept alive in large part due to the work of Athanasius. So this is the period, obviously, after Nicaea. But this is important because what you see here is that in 357, Osius of Corduba banned terminology of homoousios on the grounds that they weren't terms you could find in the Bible. Now, you see that oftentimes the sort of biblicist impulse, where if the term is not directly in Scripture, then you've got to get rid of it, which when you do theology that way, you can't really do theology at all. And so you see this here in 357. 27 years, I guess, after Nicaea, you have the emperor wanting to ban the terminology that's found in the Nicene Creed. You would think that if in 325 it was all about this, imperial consensus, and that's the only way we have Trinitarian theology, you would think that the fact that imperial force is being used to otherwise would tell a different story of some sorts. So the events of 357 to 61 in the Creed of Nike end up actually breathing fresh air into the Nicene theology. So I recommend you read this whole essay. I think it's hopefully valuable in some sense. But what I want to get at is, number one, just because there's imperial engagement doesn't necessarily mean something's right or wrong. You see it on both sides. You see imperial enforcement trying to force one thing or another. That doesn't tell me if something's true or not. The Arians ultimately have somebody enforcing their view. Does that then mean automatically by fiat that they are wrong? Well, they are wrong, but not because of some emperor enforcing anything. That doesn't have anything to do with anything. The winner of the theological debates is not because of imperial enforcement. If imperial enforcement is the measure of that, then you don't have a clear winner at all. What ends up happening is that true theology ends up winning out because it is what the church has confessed since the very beginning. We have Jesus and Paul saying these things. We have the New Testament witness saying these things, and then you see them developed later on. So Nicene theology, what is it? Well, there's an important sense in which there's a distinction between the creed itself and its own historical context, and then the developments that do happen over time as it becomes more sophisticated, more enlarged, more clear what the entailments of the Nicene Creed are or have. And so I just talked to Adam Renberg earlier today, about some of these things. He's written a really nice essay on the difference between the judgments and concepts of the Nicene Creed and Nicene theology, where the judgments sort of represent the purest historical aspects of what was actually happening in 325, whereas the concepts are the things that are developed later. So the things you're going to get later in Constantinople III, which are organically developed from the Nicene Creed and Nicene theology, organically developed. They're natively within the theology that's there. It's just not explicitly drawn out. And so this is just the way the development of doctrine functions. So you can look at Vincent of Lérins, you can look at later John Henry Newman has a nice work on the development of doctrine. And you see how doctrine organically develops. And it's not artificial, not externally imposed upon the text. It's just freshly growing out of it. So there's a really nice short book in 2024. There you go, Christological Hellenism, Lewis Ayres. I'm going to throw up a page here. So if you're of the sort of reading type, you can pause the video if you want. Boom, you can see that. I don't know. Videos flipped. I don't know. Maybe that worked. Maybe it didn't. Sorry if it didn't. It's on page 61. You can get a copy of this. It's affordable. I remember these things are like $15. But he basically sort of talks about the limited positive content of the Nicene Creed itself, and how the conceptual apparatus is only lightly determined, and they're open to a wide range of expansion. Boundaries are set both by what will be philosophically persuasive and by what fundamental theological commitments will permit. And so he says Christian belief is providentially underdetermined philosophically and hence persistently generative. I think these are some interesting comments on the nature of Nicene theology. Adam's essay that I mentioned, he covers sort of the example of Eusebius of Caesarea, who would be later on determined as probably not within Nicene theology because of some of his subordinationist light views, where how the Son gets his divinity. But he signs up to the Nicene Creed. And so in a sense, you want to say, yes, he is Nicene. In a historical sense, yes, in 325, he's Nicene. But as the doctrine is explained and developed and clarified, he's not. But maybe he is. I mean, you can't go back and judge someone in history for something they didn't have the opportunity to engage and learn in. And that's just the truth about all theological developments. You've got to be careful of taking something that's happened later on and imposing these standards of these opportunities for refinement and expansion back on to an earlier period. So what is Nicene theology? Well, I typically, if I attach the word Nicene, like the word theology to it, I'm not taking it in a purely historical descriptive sense of let's go back and just look at 325. I'm looking at something far broader and far bigger than that. I'm looking, yes, at the creeds and the councils, but I'm also looking at the confessions that happen later. I'm looking at the theological masters throughout the Christian tradition, and I see them as all sort of waypoints that fill this continuous Christian tradition that we can read holistically together as developing a fully orbed Nicene theology. So as we get later and later in Christian development, there's smaller and smaller areas for making silly errors to be non-Nicene. And so, I mean, there's still these corner cases that you have to engage, though, of like, well, what if someone wants to push back on something really small in the Nicene Creed? I don't know what that would be. Let's pull. I guess I should have the Nicene Creed memorized, right? Let me pull it up and we can look at it together. Does Logos, is that the first one? No. Boom. What we believe. Catholic bishops. Cool. All right, they're coming in clutch for us today. Two positive things about Roman Catholics today. Look at me. General ecumenicist. I believe in one God, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. Is there anything you could really push back on? I don't know. Well, yeah. So I don't really know what, I guess maybe something you push back on is sort of what does Catholic mean about the church if you're an annoying Baptist or something like that, or an evangelical who doesn't get what that means. And yeah, so I'm not really sure where the corner cases you could push back on, but maybe you're looking at some other creeds or confessions and you want to push back on certain aspects of it. Vincent of Lérins does have a really nice sort of like hierarchy of authorities and how to interpret things and how to understand what you can reject and what you can modify and when you can do it and when you can't. So he sort of starts with scripture on top. That's the norming norm, right? He doesn't use that terminology, but that's functionally what he's arguing. And then underneath that, you do have sort of the creed and the council, that sort of authority that's explaining and guarding what scripture teaches. And then under that, you have various theological masters. So if something's underdetermined by scripture and then it's underdetermined by the creeds or the councils, then you can look at the theological masters. If there's sort of unity among the theological masters, that's something you don't want to reject. So maybe it's an implication of the Nicene Creed. Divine simplicity, for example, you would say maybe divine simplicity is assumed, but it's not explicitly had here. So let's start with scripture and say, okay, scripture underdetermines it, creed council underdetermines it. So what about the theological masters? Well, you have the theological masters, and we find sort of a version of divine simplicity from the very beginning to the early modern period, just sort of universal. And so if you have that, you have sort of a very strong theological case, historical case to say, this is something that you should believe as Christian. This is something you don't have the freedom to sort of just reject willy-nilly or modify. It is sort of part of this Nicene theology, which takes on like a broader concept than does just the Nicene Creed itself. So hopefully that makes sense. So I wanted to talk just a little bit, like I said, about the crazy tweet from Dale, where apparently the fact that Constantine showed up at 325 means that Nicene orthodoxy is something that no one actually wanted. They didn't actually believe. They were forced into it with their hands tied behind their backs. That's just not true. Do your history, do your homework, read. Don't just read one source. Don't read two sources. Read a significant amount. We have a ton of material on it. And the reality is that period is messy. You have different people trying to understand things and engage, and that's what happens in debates when you're trying to iron things out. But that by itself there doesn't say anything to me about Nicene theology. So hopefully this was useful in some sense. I don't know. You tell me. I just thought I'd talk a little bit about Nicene theology for a few minutes, because that's always good and fun. So I look forward to your feedback and your comments, and I'll talk to you all, or think with you all soon.